So welcome everybody to this event. I'm going to do a little introduction. One of our panelists, Sewell Chan, is not quite here yet, but by the time we start, I'm sure he will be. He's on his way. I'm Steve Adler. I'm an adjunct professor here, and I run the Ethics and Journalism Initiative, which is now in its second year. I'm former editor-in-chief of Reuters, and so that's about as much credential as I'm going to share with you. Let me just take a moment to tell you about the Ethics and Journalism Initiative. This is something we started out so that students can ask additional questions about journalism ethics as they're going through their classes, they're freelancing, working on projects. It gives them an opportunity to talk to people who have dealt with these issues in the past. Then we started doing student workshops, so those are just for students and they're not on the record. And they just give us an opportunity to grapple with ethical issues. And then we do public events, which this is one, so this is entirely on the record, and we try to bring in panels of people who can talk about contemporary issues that really matter, and the issue we're talking about today is very much on the news. And we also have a website called ethicsandjournalism.org, so I recommend you check it out. We're building it up, it's getting better and better. And Ryan Housel is the managing editor. She's in the back. So if there's anything you want to think about writing for it or getting involved in some way in the website, Ryan is the person to talk to.
We're in office 606 downstairs, right by Candy in the front desk. So come by anytime. I'd love to hear your
While I'm doing introductions, we also have two graduate students who are assisting the program. Julia Doyle, where's Julia? Is over here. And Jordan Brown, who is downstairs greeting people. So that's the team, but we've got lots of interesting plans. We're thinking of doing things that we're not currently doing, so we'll try to continue to communicate what we're working on so you know about it. Yes, Ryan.
I also just wanted to shout out an upcoming public event that is pretty soon. It's on this coming Tuesday, the 24th, same time, same place, and it'll be with John LaHook, CBS's senior medical correspondent, and he'll be talking through various ethical questions that arise in his medical reporting. He'll be having videos and asking questions. It'll be really interactive and really interesting to any student or journalist, but especially those interested in science and medical reporting or interested in broadcast and television. So we really encourage you to be there. There will be lunch as well. Like I said, same time, same place, and he's a great speaker, and we're really excited to have him.
And he just did a report that he's going to talk about this past Sunday morning on anti-vaccine sentiment and how he's dealing with that as a medical journalist. So that's one of the things that should be interesting. Before I introduce the panel, one very special birthday shout out. I believe today is Joel Simon's 60th birthday. And congratulations.
Are we going to sing?
It's a very special birthday. Joel is very young by my standards. And Joel is a real leader in the journalism security and press freedom area. He ran the Committee to Protect Journalists for many years. And so happy birthday, Joel. Okay. Anything else before I start, Ryan? No. Good.
I think so. Sewell's about 10 minutes out.
Okay. Well, I'll introduce the panelists we have here, then Sewell will show up and it'll look entirely seamless. First, let me introduce Kathleen Carroll. She was AP's executive editor from 2002 to 2016, and that's a grueling number of years to do a job like that. She's former board chair of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I'm going to do a bonus fact, not a fun fact, for each person. She's a staunch supporter of local journalism, and she chairs the board of Montclair Local, which is a really good local news site in Montclair, New Jersey, so take a look at that. Then Ben Smith is editor-in-chief of Semaphore, previously media columnist for the New York Times, and before that, editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News, something that will come into our conversation a little later. He's author of Traffic, Genius, Rivalry, and Delusion, and the Billion-Dollar Race to Go Viral, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. And I found a bonus fact that I didn't know. He studied linguistics in college. That's interesting.
Total mistake. Don't do that.
Okay. So the issue today is under what circumstances, if any, is it ethical for news organizations to publish information from hacked files, especially during an election race? And so I'm going to basically read what is not a hypothetical to our panelists and just ask them how they would handle that situation if they were currently in it. So you've just received emails from a sender who claimed to be named Robert. The sender offered access to internal documents from the Trump campaign, including a 271-page dossier that the campaign had prepared in February to identify potential vulnerabilities of J.D. Vance before he was selected as Trump's vice presidential running mate. Very helpfully, Robert said in an email to you, "I suggest you don't be curious about where I got them from. Any answer to this question will compromise me and also legally restricts you from publishing them." So I'd love it if each of you could take us through the steps you would take from the moment you got those emails, what exactly you would do, and then ultimately what would you decide. Let's start with Kathleen. So it gives you a chance to think.
Yeah. This is a really tough one, but, I think whenever you get information over the transom, you should treat it as something that you should do reporting on. And so what I would do, didn't have to do, would do is say, what do we know about it? Is it true? What's the value of the information that's in the files? And is it something that we need to know? Is it something that the readers need to know? Is it something that is important to the issue, in this case, the presidential race and the search for a vice president? Is there anything surprising in there? Is there information we can get some other way just by talking to people? You use it as a springboard, not just as a well, we're going to put this right out the door.
Yeah. So in this situation, how do you see, knowing the facts that you know, what do you see yourself doing? Obviously, news organizations that got this information did not publish it, to my knowledge, which seems a little odd since they published everything about Hillary Clinton's emails. What's your thought process, and what do you think you would do based on this current fact pattern?
It's a little hard to answer that without knowing what was in them, and there's only been one organization of the three that I'm aware of that got it, that has explained their thinking about why they didn't publish. So, I don't know what I would do without seeing what it is and finding learning what we would learn by doing reporting about it. But I do think, to answer a question you've posed to us in another way, it's really important to tell readers what your thinking is and your decision is about it. And I know there's a lot of discussion about not explaining what you're not doing, but why yes, we know about this, but we're not publishing it because of that. But I think in this circumstance, if it's known that you have it, you owe your readers an explanation for your thinking.
So even if you're not publishing it, you would publish a story saying this happened and explaining why, if you're not publishing it, you're not publishing it.
Or do a media story about who's not publishing it and offer your explanation that way, something like that. But I think putting your decisions, putting your processes out in front of the readers helps them understand your thinking and will diminish slightly the prospect of them imagining what your thinking is.
And if you know it came from an Iranian hack, does that make you less likely to publish it?
I think possibly, but it may have to do more with the news value of what's come out.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Ben, your thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate your having me here. I think Stephen always invites me to these things as sort of a cautionary tale in the field of journalism ethics. But I actually think Kathleen's response was really interesting because you've probably thought about and dealt with these problems as much as anyone in the world, and the answer is these are very complicated, subjective questions. And there's and I don't know, are the Iranians worse or better than if it was the Russians? That's not a question that your journalistic ethics handbook is going to answer for you. And yeah, I guess ultimately the biggest story, assuming that these aren't, to put aside a really interesting question is what if these were revelatory, fastened documents that would change how you saw J.D. Vance and Donald Trump in some profound way? That's a different, which it seems like they're not, which makes it kind of an easy question, right? That's the more interesting hard question. But in the context where they're not, obviously it is a bigger story that the Iranian government is trying to hack Donald Trump and screw up his campaign than it is that the Donald Trump campaign did opposition research on J.D. Vance, found the same stuff you would do if you did Google J.D. Vance for a couple days. Okay, that's normal that they would do that. If somebody leaked you that in a really innocuous way, like some disgruntled campaign staffer leaks that to you, the obvious story to write, which is a story, is wow, the Trump campaign definitely knew about all this stuff that then immediately blew up in their faces. Like, that's a legitimate kind of interesting story. But you obviously, what you're seeing is news organizations really are weighing that against, you know, the really ugly intentions of their sources. And people will say they don't pay attention to the intentions of their sources, but of course they always do a bit. And there's some balancing act happening there that I think is you know, basically appropriate, but you do, in journalism, constantly are faced with this situation where your sources have often motives that are gross in a much pettier way, but that are really negative, and you have to sort of, that's a thing you have to navigate. And the you know, an Iranian regime seeking to kind of protect its dictatorship, nuclear program, ability to destabilize the region is like the far extent of that, but it's sort of on the spectrum.
So,
But it's even more than that. You know, people's motives are reporting tools. I mean, when you're trying to find out something, you go to the cranky or the disgruntled staffers, you know, or the former staffers or people who've left. I mean,
Would you call up foreign intelligence agencies?
possibly. Yeah. But I mean, that, you know, there's just no clear line. You need to understand. And even if people have come to you with something, their motives may not be great, but what they have is valuable, and the readers need to have it. I mean, that's just, you need to be aware of motives, but there's not necessarily an automatic yes or no answer when you find out what the motive is.
I mean, but isn't it newsworthy? Forget the motive for a minute. Isn't what's in somebody's opposition file, wouldn't you ordinarily, in the course of day-to-day political coverage, say, oh, this is interesting, this is what they dug up, most of it's public record, but this is what they dug up, so this is what they knew about.
Yeah.
I think, Ben, you alluded to that, but what struck me is you would ordinarily assume if this came from an innocuous source that it would be published, so it seems as if there's a very clear decision being made that because people believe it's from a foreign intelligence agency, they're just not going to publish it. And that's very interesting. I'm not sure
I think that is. I know. I think that's real. It's interesting. It's in another context, it's the mistake the media made with the Hunter Biden emails. But it's one of the really interesting. If you're sort of obsessed with this field, Macron was hacked in the run-up to not this election, but the previous one, whenever that was, and the French media, which operates much more as a cartel and a monolith, and is governed in some ways by French law, just made a decision like and this is lots of interesting, gossipy, bitchy stuff among his aides, and just made a decision we're not going to touch this stuff. And it was by the Russians, and it had no impact on the election, but it was also a lot of extremely newsworthy stuff, and an established media just deciding to skip it actually sort of reassures you about the power of the establishment media, right? Like, turns out if you just throw this stuff up on Twitter, people care less than if it's in the New York Times.
Interesting, yeah. So what if Robert said, I'm giving you this under the condition that you don't say where it came from, and it's quite newsworthy, so I'm changing the hypothetical a little bit, then what do you do? Either one.
I think you have to, and as a profession, we don't do this very well, but I think you have to get as far as you can toward explaining to your readers where this stuff came from, and you have to work with the people that are giving you things about that. You have to negotiate. What are you going to say? It fell from the sky like manna from heaven?
I think you say a source familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is the most overused word in the news lexicon. Sources, sources, sources. Oh, people you talk to. You know.
A person with access to the document.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So, I mean, don't we start extending into the whole question of anonymous sources, right? So motivation of source is really important.
Yeah. I mean, one way I think about it is just, you got to assume every single thing you do as a journalist is going to become public at some point. Everything's going to leak. Your emails are going to leak. Your source is going to go on television and talk about your interaction. And so, like, don't do anything that's going to make you look terrible, like you were in cahoots with the FSB, you know, in covering it up. And so I do, like, in some ways, like, from my perspective, a way to look at it is, like, would I be embarrassed if this was public?
Yeah. Do we as journalists owe any responsibility to discourage hackers? I mean, it's very often people say, don't write about a mass shooter, or don't show their face because you're just breeding copycat shooters, and why should you allow the person the notoriety that would come from it? And so the goal there is to basically discourage copycats. So what about hacking?
Well, Stephen, would you say, I mean, that's a conversation we've had before, would you say as journalists or like as patriotic Americans? Like, 'cause I
Well,
don't think, I mean, like, they're sort of different, right?
Well, we're operating as journalists in this country. I'm not sure you're distinguishing between those two.
Right, but if,
As,
like,
as an
if the
editor,
CIA hacks something and hands it to you, is it different from if the FSB does? I guess my view is
Yeah.
that's another axis here where
yeah,
where there's an underlying sense that we're with it appropriate,
Yeah.
that we're supposed to be
Yeah.
patriotic to our country and not
yeah,
encourage
Yeah.
foreign intelligence
Yeah.
attacks on it. But
Yeah.
sorry to ask you the question.
no, it's
but,
fine.
But,
I'm
but I think when
participating.
you were at Reuters, that added this like whole other axis of complexity to this, where Reuters really part of its incredible strength is that it is not seen by foreign governments as a tool of U.S. power.
Right. I do think there's probably a difference if you're identifying yourself as a U.S. news organization and you're not identifying yourself as a U.S. news organization, and we tried not to distinguish too much in terms of where the sourcing was coming from, but we were also incredibly transparent, trying to be incredibly transparent, whoever the source was, about the sourcing. We're talking in class tomorrow about whether you lie about your identity, whether you go undercover. Well, Reuters had an absolutely strict rule that you never did, which is different from pretty much every other news organization. And the idea was you would generate trust across the board by always behaving, straightforwardly and honestly, and we want to be transparent about our sources as well. So in this case, I think if the source said, you can't say where this is coming from, and it's coming from a foreign intelligence agency, depends on what terms that source is telling me. If they're just telling me that and I haven't agreed to it, I'm going to report that. I'm going to
What if
report.
it's like a great story?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think you
Yeah.
don't agree to anything.
Yeah.
They can tell you whatever they want, but you don't have to agree.
Yeah, and I think starting journalists sometimes don't realize you have to agree to the terms. Somebody can't tell you, these are the terms, here's the document. Or they can put it on a document, but you can't say where it came from. You have to have agreed to that in advance. Otherwise, that agreement has not been made. So just going, I also want to get Sewell's view on this, but not here yet. So just quickly going back to the comparison, I know it's a different situation with 2016. Russian hack exposed emails to and from Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, John Podesta. WikiLeaks published a trove of the emails. Mainstream news organizations covered them avidly. And they included some newsworthy information, including that Hillary Clinton had said things in speeches on Wall Street that were not the policies she was stating publicly, or that certainly showed more sympathy for people on Wall Street than she was showing publicly. And one of the people covering it was Amy Chozick, who was covering it for the New York Times at the time, and she has since written a book, which I really recommend, called Chasing Hillary. And she wrote, there was an insatiable appetite for email-related stories. Cable news talkers talked, readers clicked, clicked, clicked. It became an almost out-of-body experience, turning all of us into whirlpools set on the rinse and repeat cycle. So I guess my question is, first of all, how did the news organizations you were with at the time handle the Clinton emails that WikiLeaks distributed? What did you publish and why? Obviously, you're not going to remember every detail. And would you do the same today, Ben?
Yeah, I went back to this recently because
And-
I was.
and where were you at the time?
I was running BuzzFeed at the time.
Okay.
We were basically hyper aggressive about publishing documents, about publishing leaked documents. But I think for the same reason, probably pretty sophisticated. It had just been swimming in that water, particularly including with hackers, a bit longer. And so we definitely came in, and and this is I don't think we always covered ourselves in glory, but I actually am proud of this one because I remember the first meeting about it. We definitely, Catherine Miller, who was the political editor, and I said, okay, the Russian hack is by far the biggest story here. Like, it's a bigger story than anything in these emails, and we've got to keep framing it that way. We probably wrote a half dozen stories total over a period of months about it, mostly using, and this is where I think it is totally legitimate. You're doing a story about the inner workings of Clinton's campaign with lots of different sources. You can't unsee the WikiLeaks material. It's great source material, but you're not letting it drive what you're doing. Because ultimately, particularly when it's been posted on the internet, like one thing to remember is like, it is a huge scoop, but like Julian Assange got that scoop. If you would like to pick up the story from the other news organization, which is Julian Assange, go for it. But don't like flatter yourself you're doing something super interesting. And then the other story, and the one that you mentioned is the one where there's a question of like, you know what, this is just newsworthy. And it was that Clinton had been very avidly concealing what she said at a specific speech to Goldman Sachs, kept being asked about it, and minutes after that really gross Donald Trump audio recording on Access Hollywood came out, the Russians just like rushed that out to try to dirty up the news cycle. And Ruby Kramer, who was a great reporter covering Clinton, sort of noticed first what big news it was. It was an email where they were like, here's the worst stuff from this speech we're trying to cover up. That was the email. Bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. And I think our view is like, look, that's news.
Yeah.
And we'll frame it. We will obviously note that it's part of a Russian campaign, but wherever the fairly high bar is, that crosses it.
But wasn't the most significant thing about that is that it stepped on the Access Hollywood story, and it diminished something that might have gotten him out of the campaign, except for the attention being shifted. And so you were being a party to the attention being shifted. Hey, Sewell. This is Sewell Chan.
Sewell.
Yay.
Hi, everyone. My apologies. First week in a new job, so.
We'll do a quick introduction, and we'll get back. We're talking about the Hillary Clinton emails, so we'll come back to you on that, too. Sewell is, as of 2 days ago, executive editor of Columbia Journalism Review. I'm delighted you're there. Congratulations. Among the things he's done previously, he was editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, editorial page editor of the LA Times, and a longtime reporter and editor at the New York Times, and I'm doing bonus facts for each person. So your bonus fact is that you're a judge for the new Collier Awards for Ethics in Journalism that we're launching here this fall. And by the way, there's a student category, a local category, and national category, $5,000, $10,000, and $15,000 awards. So look on the website to get information about it. So Ben, keep going on the Hillary
Can't
emails.
believe you didn't invite me to judge those.
Maybe next cycle.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think we did stress in the story that these came from the Russians and they were trying to do a thing, but that's where the balancing act comes in. And on one side of the balance is this really big news?
Yeah, and I'd also argue that the fact that it came from Russia, the press viewed that as one story, and once we knew it. All right, it came from Russia, but every detail from the Hillary emails, and it just the flow of.
Oh yeah, there was just like a bunch of really disgraceful stuff, picking over people's like stupid gossipy fights.
Right,
and
but
stuff.
going to motivation of source, which we're talking about as well in the recent case, that's an example where motivation of source was successful in changing the conversation, and the press was a party to that.
Well, it's
incredibly successful.
But it's also important to remember that there was another Hillary email issue in the air at the time. You know, she was under investigation and not being entirely truthful about why she had a private email server and how many emails she had deleted. Yeah. And, you know, you talk about Hillary's emails, and we're cutting a nice slice of them, but that was all in the air at the same time, and those investigations were going on at the same time, and it just made everything messier.
Yeah, it's always confusing because they're really two separate Hillary email stories. Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
right. I think that distinction is important. All I would add from my memories of that 2016 race are...
And where were you in 2016?
In 2016, I was an editor at the New York Times in
Okay,
the London office.
that's what I thought,
I was
yeah.
there both when the DNC emails were hacked and the Clinton email server was going on. I was also there in London when Ben published the Steele dossier.
Which we're going to talk about next.
Which we can talk about in a moment if we haven't already. You know, the only observation I'd make is that source motivations have always mattered, and I think it's important not to be naive about that. I think even if you're talking about like a source who seems pure, like Daniel Ellsberg, who I think was relatively pure, but every source has a motivation. Now, we're always hoping as journalists that the source has a noble motivation to expose wrongdoing, take tremendous risk, put their lives and careers on the line, you know, for the public's right to know. And some sources are that noble. Many may have baser motives, and that doesn't mean that they're base people, it just means that they're human. And so I think that trying to, you know, we've always had to discern source motivation. What I think has changed a little bit, though, is that there's a lot more, you know, a lot more issues now around data theft, around the capture of information by hackers, and also by, you know, intelligence agencies, whether state-sponsored or private. And I think when you're in an age of big data, and now it's not, you know, photocopying the Pentagon Papers over a 1-week period, it's now like, you know, terabytes of data being leaked. You know, that bulk data collection, I think, introduces, you know, to me, that's the truly new element. And we still have to use our discernment, but I think what is new is the en masse collection and potential leaking of data.
Just to go back to our first question, are you surprised that major news organizations have not published the content of the hacked documents that Robert provided
Yeah.
to them?
You're asking
Yes,
me?
yeah, 'cause we've talked about it, but I wanted to-
Yeah,
yeah.
sure. You know, I'm not surprised in that I think media evolve. I think media criticism evolves. I think there's been a lot of criticism about how 2016 was handled in 2017 and all its manifestations. So I think there's a greater level of mindfulness and conscientiousness. What I will say, though, is I do feel disappointed that there was not a more robust statement from mainstream media outlets, am I allowed to say that, about why they weren't publishing more details. I think the why really, really matters, and I just came from a very conservative environment where there's a lot of built-in mistrust to the media, and I think if you're saying, now, of course, these may be people who are very happy that the Trump
That's
email...
not Columbia, but Texas,
no,
right?
we're talking about
Yeah,
Texas, right, and who actually may be happy that the Trump-related emails were not hacked, but I think there's a larger principle of understanding what we learned since 2016 and what is different. And if it's simply that, you know, we know much more scrutinizing now of source motivations, I think that's something. But I also think, to be honest, there would have been a way to cover it. The only thing I know that emerged from that hack is, I guess, this memo about potential weaknesses of J.D. Vance. Doesn't sound that surprising that a campaign would have that. But I did think that even if you're not going to release the hacked information, at least maybe describing what it is about might be a helpful step for transparency.
You know, I spent some time with the 2016 email coverage in preparation for this, and I was struck by how small a lot of the stories were. You know, it was stuff that ends up in books that only political writers and
John
operatives
Podesta
buy.
pissed off at some,
and, you
right.
know, they're worried about, you know, this particular region of South Carolina, and they're trying to figure out which surrogate to send, and you know, I just don't know that you would run those today, because they were really inside baseball and didn't always tell you anything about the campaign.
And in retrospect, are you comfortable with the way AP handled it?
You know, there was a lot of discussion going on at the time. I thought at the time we were probably doing too many stories, and we kept having conversations about, you know, what's the overarching. My whole thing in that election was, whatever happens, we don't want to be surprised. You know, we don't want to be surprised. And I was struck by, and you know, a lot of our reporters weren't, so I'm happy about the way that went. But we were always trying to have a conversation about what does this mean in the greater scheme of things. And I think we did fairly well with that, but I think in retrospect there were a lot of smaller stories that don't age well, you know.
All right, well, we're just going to go through one other issue. You can't have Ben on stage without talking about the Steele dossier. It just can't be done. It's a rule of journalism. It's a rule of panels. So, and then after that, I mean, we have an incredibly interesting range in the audience. We've got students, we have recent graduates, we have people who are, you know, longtime thoughtful critics and commentators on media. So I'd love to hear from, you know, from all groups of them, either with questions or comments on this issue. But for those of you who aren't familiar with it, on January 10th, 2017, a date that Ben will remember well, BuzzFeed published the so-called Steele dossier, which was apparently provided to several news organizations, and which BuzzFeed described at the time as, quote, a collection of memos written over a period of months, including specific unverified and potentially unverifiable allegations of contact between Trump aides and Russian operatives, and graphic claims of sexual acts documented by the Russians. In retrospect, much of it, if you've read about it, turned out not to be not only verified or verifiable, but much of it turned out not to be true. It also had the impact, many different impacts, but one was it was used persistently, and still is, by the Trump organization to denigrate the press and support allegations that news organizations are enemies of the people. If you would publish unverified, ridiculously salacious stuff about Trump, you'd pretty much do anything, so it seems to have had that effect. Ben, of course, was editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed at the time, made the decision to publish. And if you read his wonderful book, Traffic, you'll see he reflects on that, but since some of you haven't, I want Ben to talk a bit about how you decided whether to publish. Did you consider where the report was coming from, who was funding it, motivations of the sources, and would you do the same today?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, like, and yeah, it's funny because I wrote this chapter in the book about it, and my editor was like, this is incredibly defensive and terrible. You need to do better. And so rewrote it and have thought about this a lot. And I do, unlike where I did look back at the hacked emails coverage and think, you know what, actually we kind of got that right. And I think this was a really complicated one. Like, think we did the right thing, but I also, when we did it, I thought like this will be obviously vindicated as having been the right thing, and the consequences will be positive, which you never really know, and that's obviously not the case. Let's see. I mean, I think though, as we discussed in the previous thing, there's a bunch of really complicated factors at play. We like other organizations had it for weeks. Others had it for longer, but they'd been given it under the condition, by the way, that it was secret. So the whole American media was sort of operating with this kind of dark matter of these secret allegations. It was bleeding into the coverage in various ways, but they weren't allowed to say where it came
And they
from.
accepted that. The news
Yeah, and that was the deal
organizations
they'd made.
the deal.
And we just hadn't made that deal. We got the document a different way. Actually, a really classic way, which is that a source said to our reporter, I'm going to leave you alone in the room with this document. Do not take pictures of it. I'm instructing you to not take pictures of it. I will now leave you for half an hour. When I am back, you better have not taken pictures of it. And he later testified to this. And so we'd had it, and like other organizations, we had reporters in Moscow and in Prague and elsewhere trying to stand up or knock down specific facts. Hadn't been able to. We're starting to think about we're seeing this document everywhere. It's influencing the way U.S. senators in particular, Lindsey Graham, John McCain, are acting in public, and no one's allowed to say why. Like, what do we do about that? And then CNN reported that Jake Tapper reported there's this document that contains credible allegations that the President of the United States has been compromised by the Russians. It's been briefed to the sitting President, Barack Obama, and the President-elect, Donald Trump. And we're not going to show it to you. Trust us. Like, to me, at that point, that's actually not that hard to call. Like, that's a document's in brief, and the court later ruled this. It's a document that has been briefed to two presidents, and is just having this massive influence on the American conversation. You're really going to say to the public, this is credible, by the way. We're saying it's credible, but we won't show you. It'll burn your eyes out. We can look at it. That does not feel like a tenable position. The other factor in there that's kind of just weighed for us was that Christopher Steele, who wrote it, had been a very credible source. He had been the source of stories. This has all come out, but our reporter on the story, Ken Bensinger, a great reporter now at the Times, had written a book about FIFA and corruption at FIFA. And there'd been this British investigator very central to that, to uncovering this real massive corruption at FIFA, Christopher Steele. And so there was a sense, like, you know what, like, this is a serious person, which actually in this case basically didn't turn out to be true. So yeah, that's how we thought about it.
Yeah. You said something else in the book and in your excerpts. I just want to draw it out. You said you thought you had estimated the public reaction wrong. You assumed that the public would see this as, well, this isn't verified, but we're glad they're sharing with us.
Yes.
Interests of transparency. We're not necessarily going to believe it. You didn't expect that. It would have the
I
impact,
thought,
right?
and as we wrote in that piece, which by the way, another mistake we made, we published the thing as a PDF with a link to that article about how it was unverified. PDF then just takes on life its own way. In retrospect, should have stamped unverified on every page. Would that even have mattered? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We did have this kind of utopian internet sense of like, you know what, like people are just going to be able to understand what this is the same way, but that's not how the politics of information work at all. And it became this totem to mean Donald Trump's a spy. WikiLeaks did too, actually, by the way. I mean, these things become symbolic.
I'm going to turn it over in a second to Sewell and Kathleen, but did the public reaction change the way you would handle it today because you're thinking, okay, that's going to have a very extreme effect, and it may not be the effect I intend?
You might redact it more. You certainly would like just stamp on the object your objections to it. But I do think people underestimate how totally untenable it is to go on television and say, I'm holding in my hand a secret dossier that says the President of the United States has been compromised by the Russians, and I'm not going to show it to you. Like, that's not a thing. That's a totally untenable, like, wasn't tenable when Joe McCarthy was doing it, by the way, like, insane thing to do.
Okay, turn it up to both of you. But
Can I actually ask a question of Ben? I'm sorry. Just for had CNN not published that story saying there's a secret document, how do you think the rest of it would have unfolded? And how would you? And
I think we and others would have eventually found ways to write about it and maybe publish it because it was having such a huge influence on the public debate. And what CNN had reported was it had been briefed to two presidents by the director of the FBI. I mean, it was this huge central thing. So, but we jumped for that specifically because of the CNN report.
I think what's really important here is to hear what everybody is saying about what happens after you've made these hard decisions, and it's really vital to spend some time with that. When you're working on stories, or when you've had a career that's long enough, you can. I really encourage people to read history books about events they covered, because what you're hearing is you learn things that were important that you missed at the time, or you learn things that you thought were important that turned out not to be. You can't predict what's going to happen, but if you don't do that kind of high-level after action, you're never going to grow. You're going to make the same mistakes over and over again, and each situation is really complicated, and you're trying to gauge, well, is this going to happen? You're trying to gauge, well, we need to get this out. What's the way we should get it out? All these questions about sources and reactions all bear another look in retrospect that you filter back into your decision making going forward.
But I think I'm not sure I totally agree with that. Like maybe I'm disagreeing with something you didn't quite say, but I guess I think we have this social function, which is to produce information, and you actually don't ever really know what's going to happen, and you kind of do have to live with that. And sometimes the consequences are really terrible.
Yeah, that isn't what I was saying.
Okay, good.
Just quickly, if I can ask the two of you, under the circumstances that existed at the moment that Ben pushed the button, when his lawyer was at the eye doctor and she couldn't actually look at it because her eyes were dilated. But I know you read it to her, I know. But I just threw in that detail because it's an amusing one.
Such a good lawyer.
She's wonderful, yeah.
Didn't even need to read it.
Okay. But would you have published it under these circumstances? Start with you, Kathleen.
Probably not.
And
Probably
why
would have.
not?
Well, I don't know under what circumstances we would have gotten it. I guess if we had it in the same way that Ben did, we would have done more reporting around it. I don't think we would have published it. I was not at the AP at the time. I had retired by then. But I don't think we would have published it in quite the way that BuzzFeed did. But I think we would have done some reporting around it, yes.
Yeah, okay. So,
I think one of the hardest things, and one thing I'm trying to avoid in my new role, is the Monday quarterback.
Yeah.
No, go for it.
No one likes that.
I'm not sensitive.
No one likes that, right? And I do agree with Kathleen's point that we're all making decisions in the moment, and especially in news with incomplete information. I think one thing that Ben said that really struck me, and I promise I won't dodge the question, Steve, but I thought what you said was very interesting, because my memory of that day is, to be honest, I did not read your story. I clicked immediately on the PDF, which is the total human impulse in our current era. And in that PDF, we read salacious stories about Trump peeing on prostitutes at a high-end Russian hotel. And sorry, I'm repeating.
I believe that's misinformation. Would you
really-
like the details of that story?
Well, the misinformation, right. So But it's also from remember, because I read in that, I actually vividly remember that moment in the London newsroom of the New York Times, because I absolutely wondered whether Trump was getting Russian money funneled through Deutsche Bank, and was it paid Russian asset in some form, which also hasn't been proved. I will have to admit that when I got to the pee incident, I was like, I don't know, he seems pretty germ-phobic. This doesn't quite sound right. But I think the larger question is not the salaciousness. The larger question is that we're in a totally different time, right? The Pentagon the Pentagon Papers, as the prototypical example from another era, is certainly very hurried, but a team of professionals making copies, choosing which excerpts to publish in the New York Times, and then accompanying it with a really, really robust analysis, right? And it's it's not that we can't do these things in this era, but we're in such an era when people are eager to skip past the gatekeepers, the mediators, the explainers, and go straight to the source. And to me, my mind, this was a particularly dangerous example of that, because we went straight to the source, and it was like, holy mother, oh my God. And then we missed over the more legitimate explanation, which I think is a valid argument for publishing, which is that it had already been briefed to the presidents, widely available to leaders in the national security community, and which clearly shaping the dynamics of the campaign. My only question for you, Ben, because again, would there have been a way of basically summarizing what was in it without furnishing the raw document?
Yeah, for sure.
Or is that a distinction that makes no difference in the age of the internet?
I mean, I guess
think that just have been
I just think that, Yeah, of course. But I think that like it would be nice if the gatekeepers had the power, or not that the gatekeepers that had the power they had 30 or 40 years ago, but they authentically don't, and that's the thing you're dealing with.
That's a fact.
And I guess I think I don't know. I just think when you say super secret document making these allegations, you're not allowed to see it. I don't think that's I think that's a very hard.
You felt it was
position to
basically
hold.
condescending, if not.
Yeah, and my view at the time, which I am not actually a case I'm really making now because I don't think this is how it was processed, but I think like what skill do I have in looking at this that a teacher or a doctor or a construction worker, like, they can't read it? Like, what part of my, like, I don't have,
Well-
journalists don't have special magic.
But is it
what part are you? What decision would you have made had CNN not said that? I mean, you're sort of couching it as a reaction to CNN.
It really was, yeah. I think we all, in some way, would have gotten to reporting that this document was incredibly influential in shaping how the American journalistic, political, intelligence elites were approaching the most important questions in the world. And that we then would have started writing about how there was this document, and then people would have been like, wait, like, what's this document like? Does it feel credible? And at some point, probably we would have been the first to publish it, and people would have scolded us, but kind of also they would have done it 2 weeks later.
So I'd just like to make a counter argument, which Ben knows.
Stephen would never have published it.
Of course not. But just, I mean, again, I understand the nuance of it. I think Ben is an outstanding journalist, and I respect his views. So this is by no means, just dumping on Ben. I just think if you ask ourselves, what is our core function? To me, our core function is verifying information that we either find or comes into a newsroom. And as somebody who's ran newsrooms for over 15 years, stuff that's not accurate comes into a newsroom every day. It's essentially what comes into a newsroom. It flows in, it flows in, it flows in, and your job is to, look at it and try to verify it using reporting, which is our special skill.
Is that how you cover indictments?
So an indictment is a public act of the government that has occurred. It's factually true that the government has done the indictment, but you would go way out of your way to try to make sure that if there's any counter argument you can find, and you would report the underlying facts. Otherwise,
you would.
Otherwise, you're in a Central Park 5 situation.
But that would be totally unique because every newspaper in the world does nothing but publish facts stated by prosecutors, with maybe some quote from the defense lawyer if they can get them on the phone.
I think there's been a big change in that over the years, stimulated a lot by Central Park 5, and people are realizing that if you do that, you may be in a situation where you're perpetuating a real injustice. But putting that perfectly good.
I actually don't think that that's a thing journalists like to say about themselves just isn't true, that our main job is to verify things. I think if you look at the huge body of reporting that is just reporting on things that you're legally allowed to report because they're public statements, which is to say indictments, proceedings of things members of the House of Representatives say all day. Like, no, reporters aren't going out to chase those facts.
Okay.
I mean, I wish they were.
But look, you're looking at the world of rumors. There were terrible rumors during that campaign, and if you reported each of them, you would be reporting things that would turn out not to be factual, and therefore you're contributing to the misinformation and disinformation in society. And to me, that isn't your job. I think particularly because the internet allows everything out there. If you're a responsible news organization, your customers are coming to you to ask, well, is this right? Is this true? Is this accurate? And our job is to try to verify if it's accurate. So again, this may be a very old-fashioned position, but it's one I still maintain. Yeah.
I think this really robust exchange does capture, I think, something, I don't want to say it's generational because it's not about our age, it's about the generations of the consuming public, right? Like, we've always had an element of the media that was expose and reveal, and that's a reason why the line between gossip and verified journalism is sometimes a little bit thinner than I think we'd like to admit, right? And I can see the argument for, if BuzzFeed had to come to Ben's defense for a moment, on one of the most controversial decisions ever made in contemporary journalism, there's an argument that I wonder if you thought, if we didn't publish this, well, someone's going to eventually. And let me just draw that one more thought. I am not advocating for a view that someone's going to do it anyway, so we may as well do it. I don't think Ben was thinking crudely that way. But I also wonder if we're in the reality of a society now where, let's say Ben hadn't published and someone else leaked it 5 days later on their blog, and it starts being tweeted widely, you're going to actually have a problem of mistrust there because it's like, well, why didn't the mainstream media tell us about it when they knew
Yeah.
it? So I just want to pose that as was that a factor, and should that be a factor that we consider?
Yeah, it's all, I mean, being first is always a factor, and anybody who tells you it's not is lying to you in this business. Though it was, and I.
But of course,
although
when
it
we
wasn't-
say
that
being
wasn't-
first and being right.
Yeah,
is,
of course, yeah,
Yeah.
and that, but it was, that actually wasn't the dominant factor. I think I was honestly more ideological about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to open up to the audience to just make one more analogy. It's not a perfect analogy, but as somebody who's run business news organizations, I've had to think a lot about market rumors. And so there's a rumor in the market, and it's moving the market. The rumor is something that's factually not true and very well has been planted by a short seller or somebody else trying to manipulate the market. So what do you do?
Right,
And-
but if
and
it's in a
some ways there are
shareholder
some-
lawsuit, you cover it because you have legal cover, even if it's the exact same nonsense.
I think if it's a shareholder lawsuit, at least at the Wall Street Journal and Business Week and Reuters, I think we would be super careful to challenge its assumptions, particularly with a lawsuit as opposed to an indictment. But that
Yeah, I just do think
Yeah,
there's an
okay, go
underlying
ahead.
legal. I think there's an underlying like legal infrastructure that we don't think about that much. But sometimes it's like we have these highfalutin ethical rules, but for many, in some cases, the rule is, can you get away with it?
Can I ask you, Ben? I know that
last
you,
comment, and then let me open the floor.
Ben, I gather that you had a vigorous conversation. I surmise that you had a vigorous conversation with your lawyers at BuzzFeed. Can you tell us a little bit about how that conversation unfolded?
I think Nabia would have to be the one to tell you that story. But no, I mean, I think we actually believed, and it's funny because the real vigorous conversation was when I went on TV and talked about it before I had totally understood my lawyer's point of view on it, and basically accidentally closed off a bunch of lines, the usual lines of defense of like, I'm an idiot, I didn't know what was in it, whatever. Like you want to sort of leave all these things open for your lawyers.
Yeah.
But the conversation we'd had was like, we think this is of public interest, and it's fundamentally a public document in the way that an indictment is a public document. It has been used, it's cited in other public documents. It turns out it's being briefed to the president. Like it's a public document. That's what a court ultimately ruled.
And you prevailed in any of the lawsuits that were
And
filed.
and then that is
Right.
what this conservative judge in Florida finally ruled, sort of ending the litigation around it. But that was what our conversation was about. But also, I moronically went on television and made that argument in a way that foreclosed. And our lawyers were like, "Crap! Like, guess that's what we're going to court with."
Okay, let's open the floor. Who's bringing the mics around? Julia, are you doing that? Okay. Jacob, but then just pass them around. Jacob's at the back there.
Better. Is that better?
Yep.
That shaped my thinking, which was the Sony hack. I think it was 2014. North Korea shut down Sony, actually shut down the company, took all of their internal database, email, made it available to reporters, but not directly or easily available to the public. And as I remember, the New York Times and lots of other major news organizations pretty much helped themselves and published all kinds of stuff from it. It was very salacious, it was very juicy, it was very interesting. I think in general it failed a real test of public interest or newsworthiness beyond, isn't that kind of juicy gossip. And also, it was an extreme case because a hostile foreign power was trying to prevent free expression, something the press should always have a great interest in. It didn't like this Seth Rogen movie, and so it tried to prevent that, the company that made it from making any other movies. And that left me feeling that a lot of what the press does in these situations is try to come up with justifications for publishing things it wants to publish, and that what really has to be done instead is to come up with neutral principles that can be applied across episodes. And a lot of the frustration, this was sort of the premise of the panel, is that there's a clear inconsistency now in how the Hillary hacked emails were treated versus how the Trump hacked emails are being treated. And this is where I want to kind of turn it back to all of you and ask you what those principles are. I've got three, which I can run by you, but I'm not sure it gets you to an answer in all cases. The first, which is worth talking about, is that it should be the press's decision. This decision is protected by the First Amendment under the Pentagon Papers case. And we shouldn't take that for granted, because there are sitting justices on the Supreme Court who would like to revisit that case and don't feel the press should have as much discretion. But preserving the press's discretion will probably depend in part on handling it responsibly. So what are the principles? I would say one, which is the one that tends to be applied but not necessarily in a consistent way, is public interest. It's analogous to newsworthiness, but it's a little bit stronger. It says if you have something, it's not enough that people find it interesting. There has to be a justification that it matters in terms of public policy, in terms of the outcome of the election. But the other one is, I think, the hacking source does matter. And if it is a hostile power and the intent of the hack is to undermine American democracy, affect the outcome of the election, prevent free expression, it seems to me that the level of scrutiny the press then has to apply is very, very high. So I guess what I would say is I'm much more comfortable with the reluctance around the Trump emails than I was comfortable around the Hillary emails. Sorry, that's a lot, but please react.
Well, I think you've got, that's a really good point, Jacob. And there also is a newness factor as well, right? You know, we've seen a bunch of emails from campaigns now. We've seen a bunch of other leaked emails, and they're all pretty boring. I mean, they don't, the newsworthiness test that we were applying in 2016 was we'd never seen these kind of things before, and now we have. But I think the point that you make and that Ben has made about what's the source and what is their intention deserves, especially when it's a foreign power or an institution, deserves more scrutiny than we have as a profession tended to give it.
Cyril?
Sorry. Jacob, thank you. I think you make a really interesting point. In 2014, I remember I worked on an op-ed by Aaron Sorkin, who was really pissed off about that Sony leak, hack. And I edited it. It was a strong op-ed. It was really well argued. But I remember thinking a little bit at the time, he's just pissed because his Hollywood buddies have been embarrassed by all of this, and I don't know if this is that big a deal. And I think a decade later, I look back on that, and I think it was more complicated. My only question to you is, are you suggesting that, I think it's a given that we should report on North Korea trying to undermine American interests, you know, the deeply disturbing nature of a foreign adversary obtaining these corporate documents, yada, yada. So definitely we agree on that, but are you saying that because it's an authoritarian regime doing the hacking, we should not report on it because the provenance is compromised? Or is it because like the source is kind of contrary to America's interests and we are also Americans as well as journalists?
Is there a contradiction between those two things? But I would go to a strong negative presumption to publish when the context is a source that is a hostile power, and specifically if it's a hostile power with intent to influence, say, an election.
Yeah, I do think like what you're talking about is incredible irony that Donald Trump revels in, welcomes, invites this hacking, benefits from it, and now is benefiting from all the lessons we learned at Hillary Clinton's expense. Like that sucks. But also probably appropriate that we learn things. I guess I just get nervous when you start coming up with excuses to not publish stuff.
Wait, so did you publish the Vance dossier?
No, I don't have it, and I don't know what's in it, so I can't say. But I just think that like when you have people in newsrooms sitting around being like, well, you know what, like our duty as patriots is to keep secrets. It just makes me nervous, and it's the beginning of a very dangerous slippery slope. Because like, what if it's bad people in America? Like, what if it's the people you think are the bad people? Say if you think the Trump campaign is the bad people, like what if they have something really damaging? You think they're against democracy too, and it would really hurt Kamala's campaign. It's like very easy to step out onto that slope and just get into the cover-up business.
Let's get more questions. Dick Tofel next, and then we'll go around some more.
Yeah, I want to shift a little bit back to the trust issue and pose a different kind of hypothetical question. I'm old enough to remember when elections in this country were not close. Suppose that the exit polls in 6 weeks, 7 weeks, whatever it is, show that the election has been won outside the margin of error nationally and in every state. Would you each suggest that people on television and on the internet and on Twitter who are at contractual liberty to tell people that when they know at 6 o'clock at night, or that they keep it a secret until the polls are closed 4 or 5 hours later and stare into the televisions and pretend that they have no idea who's going to win. And I will say for myself, one of the big reasons that I've actually, I think, been Ben's primary defender on this for 7 years and still am, is because I remember that, and I thought it was an appalling example of journalism, that the people who were the most trusted people in America, the television anchors, essentially sat on television, for instance, in 1984, and just lied to the American people for hours and hours and hours, saying, we have no idea who's going to win the election, and then they would hint at things like, it looks like it could be a good night for President Reagan. It looked like a good night for President Reagan because it turned out President Reagan won 60, 40, and 49 states, and every single one of them knew that was exactly what was going to happen. So anyway, let's say miraculously that this happens in 6 weeks. Tell people or don't tell
I want to
people?
start with Kathleen because the AP collects votes and
Now, the
counts
AP
votes.
is a little tricky, so I want further
we're
for the
gonna get everybody.
hypothetical, right? You're contractually allowed to tell. AP gets off easily.
Okay.
They've agreed not to, but if you had this from a source
Do you want
that
to
you could
explain the
use.
exit poll consortium?
Yeah,
and
that's
how-
not, that actually isn't true, Dick, that all the years that I spent in the exit poll consortium, years that I will never get back. The people are locked in rooms and you're not supposed to be leaking it and you're not supposed to be telling they're not supposed to, they're not free to do it. The rules may have changed since I left, but all the time that I was involved in it, the idea was not to be telling it, and the problem was anchors who were winking and nodding, and coupled with the fact that exit polls were incredibly inaccurate and becoming more so with each year. So it's not a great example of the point you're trying to make is if you know something, should you tell people? But the rules of the polls don't allow you to say what's happening until whatever the time is. It used to be, 6 o'clock in the evening, and it was related to poll closures. And people, the networks were terrible about leaking what they weren't supposed to leak in amongst themselves. So maybe they've changed the rules, but.
So you have the opposite problem.
I have the
They were
opposite problem.
supposed to
They
not
were
do
supposed
it,
to not
but they
talk.
were doing it.
And
Okay.
and the other issue was that the reason exit poll technology has changed somewhat is because they were becoming increasingly inaccurate and had to be weighted statistically because Republicans number one, people were not going to the polls. They were voting in all kinds of other ways, and exit polls were standing outside of polling places. Republicans would see the U.S. network's names on top of the exit poll form, and they wouldn't answer, or they would fib. So I hope they are better now, but for all the years that I was involved in them, they were not particularly great.
So let me just ask Ben and Sewell, accept the premise of the hypothetical that for whatever reason we know the outcome, but we are collectively not sharing it. And this happened in newsrooms like mine. I mean, we all knew, but so you could call your friends if you wanted to and say, hey, but the public didn't know. But on the other hand, the reason is to let people vote. So it's a patriotic reason. Let the votes close. Let people vote before they know the outcome. So just what are both of your views?
Well, do you want me to? I'm going to take a more traditional position, Steve, of yours and Kathleen's. Dick, I do know that, on election day around 4 or 5 p.m., there will be some data shared among a closely guarded group of editors, and it often will suggest a direction. But I'd point out technically that day of exit polling is much less useful now than it would have been in 1984 because so many people are voting early, voting absentee, blah, blah, blah. But secondly, I think do we have a responsibility as journalists to factor in the safeguards of our democracy? I do think that. I do think it's I'm not saying we can wait until Hawaii is completely done because God knows how many hours, they're 8 hours behind us. But I don't, 6, but I think there's some But I do think, I mean, like, our largest state is on the West Coast. I'm uncomfortable with the, I don't think this is like there's a reason not because, just because a group of people decide not to do something doesn't mean it's a conspiracy. It could mean they got together and wisely decided not to do something out of prudence. I guess that's where I'd fall.
Ben?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that deeply. I think you can be silent. There's a difference between being silent. Like if you're publishing on the web, you're allowed to not publish something you know. I agree with you. The idea that you're on air lying is bad and to be avoided. Maybe just keep that guy in the dark.
Okay, I'd love to get a question from a student first. So somebody who's a student, raise your hand, and Julia will, yeah, go ahead.
Gina's like a student of life.
We'll get to Gina and Joel.
Hi, I'm Pau, student here. Lately, I've been hearing from a lot of like liberals, left-wing people that they are not happy with the coverage of the election from the New York Times and similar outlets because they feel that trying to be balanced, they are portraying Trump as more presidential, as reality shows. So first of all, would you agree with that assessment? And a follow-up, do you think that the fact that these same outlets are not publishing those leaked documents also factors and fits this narrative? Thank you.
Anybody?
I mean, I do think that that's a reason to think about publishing those documents or be more transparent about them, because it does feed into that narrative that the press is somehow covering up for Trump. I mean, I think that narrative is lunatic, fringe, deranged, and that people need to get off social media.
Well, let's say the 20% of Americans who are quite left, or 15, it's smaller, but it's like, believe that, but it's no more real or less real than the 40% who are totally pro-Trump. I mean, what you're referring to is essentially the false equivalency debate, and it's a very complicated one. Rachel Maddow last night at the Columbia Journalism School talked about how, you know, sometimes because we are trying to do our job well, it comes across as false equivalency, but it is partly the unique circumstances of Trump. She gave as an example, right? He said something crazy about like Canadians and their water supply ending up in some California bathroom or something. It made no sense. I mean, he's, you know, space aliens, whatever. And it's like, he might be spending 40% of his speech talking about it, but we'll focus, because we're trained this way, to focus on the 5% of the speech that maybe had a substantive policy. And so if we're reporting on that, on the one hand, it's true to our training, but the impression it leaves is that he's more serious than he in fact is. And I just don't think that's an easy one to resolve. And it's easy to hammer and say false equivalency, but I also think, what else would you have us do? I think that our saying that for the umpteenth time, like, Trump is a mortal threat to democracy and therefore we're not going to cover him doesn't work anymore.
And I would just say, I think that like that group will not say that, but it cuts both ways. Because, I mean, Trump has a weird sense of humor. His fans love it. But like there is a share of coverage of Trump, and you know, there are long essays written about sort of how authoritarians use humor and stuff. Like, I'm not trying to elide all that, but there are definitely times when he thinks he's joking, his audience thinks he's joking, and it is written without any suggestion that he might be joking, that he's about to be a dictator on day one or something.
Kathleen, is the New York Times hopefully right-wing? Hopelessly right-wing?
No, I just, you know, I think we're in an age where everybody wants the media they consume to reflect their own personal views, and it's not possible. And there are just as many people who think that, you know, covering any Democrat is a sin against God, and we shouldn't do it. So, I mean, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm with you on the lunatics, you know. Don't cover the guy who's getting, you know, 50% of the vote.
Let's go to Gina, and then we'll take another student, and then back over here.
Hi, I'm Gina Chua, executive editor at Semaphore, but before that I was executive editor at Reuters, so like I'm watching Mommy and Daddy fight on stage. Not so good. So I thought I would try and sort of step in.
We've been fighting for years, though. So.
Fair, but I've been trying to make peace for years with both of you. So not really a question, I just wanted to raise 2 points and throw in a question so it sounds like it's a question. The distinction I think that sort of Ben made about, so, you know, it's a public document. I mean, admittedly, BuzzFeed made it, sorry, we're going back to the Steele dossier. BuzzFeed made it a public document, but it was functionally a public document, and as he said, like, would you publish an indictment? And Steve, you correctly pointed out, that's officially a public document. I think there's an interesting point at which at what point do you think something is a public document? And we've got, and clearly indictments are, and the Steele dossier before it's published is not, and then it is. But we've seen much more, and frankly, a trend that journalists and journalism schools have encouraged, which is publish your work. Here's the document, here's the leaked document we got, here's the this we got, so you can see it yourself. And to the extent that there is a question about how fully accurate are these things, I think that's a really, the real question then is, if you were to do, the Supreme Court case recently that the New York Times just published with the leaks, would they put all those documents out, redacted or not redacted? They're not all verified necessarily, right? So I think there's a sort of a question about where you draw the line between what is truly a public document and what's not. So there's a no question there, but I just throw it out. The other one I just wanted to sort of just say as the non-American who is working mostly in American news organizations is to talk about the idea of a foreign power. Sure, but I'm not American, so to some extent, I live here, and it'd be nice if democracy survived. But the CIA goes on and hacks people all around the world, and they release that, and they give it to American news organizations to say, hey, report on this is happening in Pakistan, or this is in. I don't think there is a single American editor out there who goes, maybe democracy in Pakistan will be compromised if we write this thing that the CIA hacked, right? And so I just not a real question either, just sort of want to sort of put in some context here.
Can I just quickly respond to the first part of what Gina said? I think in a case we don't have time to talk about today, but that really is interesting to me is the leaked Supreme Court decision in Dobbs, which was, of course, Politico's scoop. And that was an example where, obviously, I don't think it was a hostile foreign actor, but clearly whoever leaked it, and we don't know to my knowledge, right, had some kind of agenda of some kind. And I think Politico was very aware of that, talked extensively about what those agendas varying might be, and nonetheless decided to go ahead with it. And I'm just wondering about that. It's not, that wasn't a hacked document, but it was a strategically leaked one.
But I guess, we're not in the secrets business. Like, the Supreme Court has people who are in that business. They screwed up. It got to us. We're in the publishing thing business. If you want to have secrets, don't give them to journalists. And this, maybe the Supreme Court should operate more like the Fed and stop trying to have all these secrets. But I just don't think that's our call. Why? What do we? That's just not we're getting outside our lane if we're having conversations about that.
Can I just add one quick thing? So I think the point, and as Ben said, the original sin was putting up the PDF without the story so that people would skip through. It's true that when you do sort of, here are all the documents that, backed up my story, you tend to put it in the context and you tend to force people. I think in the new world that we're in, we have to be really careful about what we put up separately from the story.
Okay, another question from a student, and then we'll go to Margaret after that. Somebody on this, more of the student side, want to have a question? If not, I'm sorry, did somebody raise their hand? Okay, Margaret? Oh. Well, okay, we'll come to you next, Molly. Go ahead.
Hi. Hi,
Okay.
Margaret Sullivan. And the reason I'm asking this question is because I teach a required ethics course at Columbia Journalism School.
And Margaret runs the sort of parallel ethics and journalism program at Columbia.
Little sister.
And was the greatest public editor in the history of the New York Times.
Thank you.
we should
That's
say.
kind.
And writes a column for The Guardian. Go ahead.
And
Hello.
author of Newsroom Confidential, a truly essential read.
Oh, thank you. That's
being
very kind, everybody. So my question...
Is there a question in there?
Great editor of the
I mean,
Buffalo News.
This is actually a comment, not a question. My question is, so I'm going to be talking about this with my students on Friday, and I've had them read a story that was in the Washington Post in which many of you guys were quoted about why Robert's leak hasn't been published in places like the Washington Post. But I guess I'm wondering, if we could boil it down, and maybe each of you, including Steve, could just say a sentence about this. What is the ethics takeaway here? I mean, there's so much gray area, and I understand that, and that's fine, but I'm not sure, what is it that we are, can we boil it down a little bit into what the ethics aspect of this, the ethics and journalism aspect of this, what are we saying?
I want to start on that one. So my sentence would be, publish information that is newsworthy, of interest and importance to the public, and put it in the context as transparently as you can of where it came from. If it's newsworthy, I'd publish it, even if I didn't like the source.
And is newsworthiness pretty much the same as public interest or public whatever?
Well, again, I'm probably old-fashioned in thinking if it's, you know, salacious and a lot of fun and gets you a lot of clicks, I do not put that in that category of public interest and newsworthy. But we're looking at an election in this particular case, so if it's going to be interesting and useful to somebody who cares about the election, and personally I think it probably is. It may not be the most newsworthy thing in the world, but if there's information in there that the average person doesn't know, and it's interesting to see how the Trump administration was vetting, the Trump campaign was vetting their vice presidential candidate, I'm guessing that I would have found that at least somewhat newsworthy, and I would have put it in the context to whatever I knew about where it came from. So, well, okay. Well, I don't necessarily publish content I know not to be true. I probably don't, but I say there's this thing, and they looked at these particular, you know, issues. I mean, I would be careful about things I had not verified. I really would.
Yeah, I'm in the same place, newsworthy, verifiable.
Sorry, the question specifically about the Vance stuff?
No,
or-
no, I think of, you know, using hacked material.
I guess my view is it's a more complicated balance than we like to admit, and the how bad is the like hacker? Like, where do you weigh the Iranian government versus just like somebody really terrible with bad motives? And and I think that's a very subjective question, and it's hard to draw clean rules.
So,
You also say, and I think this is great, you know, I think it's a very defensive thing to say, and I don't disagree with it. We're not in the secrets business.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly strong presumption toward publishing.
Yeah, we're not in the secrets business. Try to publish, right?
For sure.
I mean, I don't know if that's an ethics statement.
It's not
but
an ethic.
a-
No, I think
right.
I think we get out of our lane sometime. We're not philosopher kings. We have this social function, which is to publish stuff. We're not really smart enough to figure out like what the long-term consequences are, and shouldn't try too hard.
Man, I'm torn here. I like to think that you're not
Sewell's smart
that
enough.
you're not actually all that far apart. I mean, I certainly agree with the baseline principles that Steve and Kathleen lay out. I guess, look, the only thing I'll add is that I think, and this gets to Ben's point, I think somewhat, is that the media owe us a better. I think I have not read specifically enough about Robert's motivations and about why mainstream news organizations aren't running with it.
Robert the hacker. I thought we were talking about Justice Roberts. That's where I got lost.
Oh, sorry. No, Robert, the anonymous hacker who, for all I know, could be an embittered Trump campaign junior operative or a Democratic opposition. I have no idea who Robert is or if his name's Robert. But I'd like to know a little bit more about the decision. To me, we would have been better served had we known a little bit more about what are the contents. Not salacious details, but, you know, like who hates who, because that's not that important. But I also want to give the editors a presumption of the benefit of the doubt here. I think if that dossier contained like stunning findings about J.D. Vance that, you know, raised grave questions about his ability to be vice president, I do think the organizations by now, at least, it's been weeks, would have found a way to verify that and disclose that in some way.
But that's really not a different answer, right? So
No,
if
it's not,
you can verify it, and if it turns out to be newsworthy, you'd publish it even if it was a really horrible source who you were trying not to encourage.
Well, yeah, largely agree with Ben that we cannot,
Yeah.
the path of determining the virtue and vices of our sources, I don't think is a productive one. I do, but I have a process point that I just think that whatever decision you arrive at, we have to remember that readers are not seeing these decisions in a vacuum. And they're saying, the student's point, you know, you treated Hillary's, it's become a late night comedy trope. You treated Hillary's emails this way, and Trump's stuff gets hacked, and you're not doing anything.
Yeah. Which also goes to the transparency. Say as much as you can about why you did or didn't make the decision and about what you know about who the source is, which means you would not have committed not to explaining who the source was. Yeah. Okay. Joel, who's got the mic here? Right. Oh, okay. You go first. You go first. Yeah, and by the way, if people need to go back to class or want to leave, we said 12 to 1:30, but I'm happy to stay until 2, and people can, even panelists can leave when they need to.
It's a really basic question, and I gotta admit, I almost know nothing about ethics. I'm very new to this. I'm from Austria. So the thing is that, what would you do if you get this information and you and your team are not on the same page? Because everyone else believes, no, we are not running this.
Yeah.
But you really, really think this needs to go out there. What do you do?
That's a great question.
Yeah, you probably. I mean, Margaret has this totally right. Newsrooms are dictatorships. But yeah, and that's the whole job.
Well, it's not newsrooms are not a democracy because ultimately a decision has
Very
to
like
be made.
consultative dictatorships, like the Saudis, like pre the most recent.
But in
regime.
general, I would say it's good practice as a manager and leader that if everyone's saying we have a problem with this, you need to address their concern somehow.
It's not a hypothetical. It happens in every newsroom practically every day, which is why they're gentle dictatorships.
Yeah. And look, there's been
Obviously, you're asking a certain constituency who should be enjoying it.
And there's been an evolution in a lot of newsrooms, and a lot of newsrooms are taking into account staff views more than they might have done traditionally. So, it's work in progress. Gina says no. Okay, Joel. Thank you. Good. It was a good question.
So just listening to this conversation, I had an amusing thought, which is obviously, the Iranians are not stupid, and what if the target of this operation was not Trump, but the U.S. media? This would be a perfect operation to hack Trump's campaign and leak a document that isn't newsworthy, just to maybe you were being trolled. Anyway, that's. I think Ben will appreciate that. I don't have it.
Yeah,
it's
just to
possible.
drive everyone
but
crazy.
It actually
Could be true.
It could be true, right? And it would be a bad strategy. But actually, really, what I wanted to
Because it is interesting that they haven't just put it on paste.
right, and they're not stupid. So, like, if based on what we know about that document, it's not newsworthy. So why would you hack someone's campaign and leak a document that's not newsworthy unless you're trolling the media? But anyway, that's I'm saying that more as a joke, but it's because
Iran trolling the media and not Trump?
Yeah, they're trolling
That's
the
a
media.
great conspiracy theory. I love it.
Yes, thank you very much for this. Is how these things get started. But that's a joke. It's officially a joke. Everyone, it's not an idea. Anyway, but the serious question is just following up on, and I should have introduced myself, Joel Simon, birthday boy. But I'm following up on Gina's point, which is this is a really it's like obviously a U.S. You're all Americans. You represent U.S. media outlets. That's obviously AP is global and Reuters. But okay, all right. You're not, but you're Americans. Let's put it. Let's acknowledge that. But there is but what I'm saying is, how does this conversation? Is there a presumption baked into this that like you have more control over how this information is distributed and gets out there into the public realm, and that the ethics that you so rigorously apply, and I'm obviously asking this question in a provocative way, are not really going to inform the outcome because there are so many other pathways that don't involve Americans and American sensibilities about government motivations and protection of American democracy and the American national interest and the public interest in a U.S. context. Those are not going to be decisions that editors outside of the U.S. necessarily apply. So how does that affect this, the way in which you're approaching these issues?
I think you have to know what your organization stands for and apply the ethics and the judgments that your organization stands for, whether it circulates only in one geographic area or more broadly. And somebody else is going to do something else, and they're representing their organization. But you can't overthink it. You have to know what you stand for and decide accordingly.
I would say I agree with that, but it's also, I think, appropriately humbling to remember that somebody who's like myself was in the news business for 40 years, the amount of influence you might have had to sort of control the news ecosystem and be pretty confident that what you're putting out there is going to become a dominant piece of communication is not the same today. That more of my students told me in the first class, grew up on, in many cases, Vice YouTube videos as the main source of news and information, and influencers are, getting more hits than news organizations, and very fewer people are going directly to news sites. So I think we need to acknowledge that we're part of a much bigger, much more diverse, and much more complicated ecosystem, and we may not, in fact, be, the decision that any one of us makes about our news organization is not necessarily going to define how this information gets out. That said, I'm really with Kathleen on the notion that to be trusted media, that for those people who want media that explains what they're doing, that abides by a certain set of standards, that states that publicly and tries to be consistent about doing it, there is value in that. And there's value in being available to people who want that and to have the brand mean something. But that's not to say that necessarily dominates the eco-universe, because the universe of communication, because it doesn't.
And I think the global stuff is really hard. Like, you obviously need to abide by the law in countries where you operate. I mean, and I think if you attempt to build a global news organization, sort of this globalized world, you're just often going to be, and I think this is truer of tech companies. You see it with Twitter right now. I think, like, there was a period when all these tech companies really thought of themselves as, like, post-national, and as these, like, global powers that were not responsible to national governments, and right now there's this, like, huge clawback of power by, like, first the Chinese, Russians, and Turks, and now the Europeans and the Brazilians, and we're a minor fish in that in a way, but I do think these are often very difficult decisions.
I certainly would never judge a journalist working under completely different situations, like under a military dictatorship or in Russia or China, authoritarian systems. I think the decision making there is going to be different because of safety, legality, staying out of prison, etc. I do think that the First Amendment is what has made possible the greatness of American journalism. And even though all three of these panelists, all of you have led global news organizations, but predicated and with the safety and protection of having the First Amendment protecting us. And that's why that legal infrastructure is so important, because you can't really talk about journalistic ethics, in my view, in a vacuum without talking about the political and legal system in which you're working.
Yeah. Let's just take 2 more questions and then get you out of here. Molly and then somebody else.
Hello, I'm Molly Stark-Dean. In full disclosure, I used to work with Professor Adler. Actually, I was in the newsroom in 2016, in the election of 2016. Also, I think it's kind of odd that we're talking about J.D. Vance rumors and there's a couch on stage. Also, why are we perpetuating rumor? I watched the most recent. Debate. I live in the largest Haitian neighborhood in the world, in Brooklyn, with a bunch of Haitians at a Haitian coffee shop, and they knew it was going to come out. And then the Haitian rumor came out of Trump's mouth, and then to verify the rumor, all these stories came out about Haitians not eating or eating cats. Yeah. And I'm wondering, verifying these rumors, are we just perpetuating them by just saying them out loud over and over?
Such a good question. Yeah. Anybody comment on fact checking?
You definitely do. You want to always try not to perpetuate, repeat misinformation. Jay Rosen of NYU talks about the famous truth sandwich notion, the idea that you should not blindly circulate mistruths, otherwise you're being co-opted by someone else's agenda. So start with what's factual, then state the mistruth. Now, of course, when the mistruth is coming from someone with already and organically as huge a platform as Donald Trump, it's pretty much out there.
Yeah, I think there's been a real evolution in this. I mean, the first time, when the first version of this in my sort of career was when, before the birther stuff, there was a big push to claim that Obama was Muslim. Like, that was the thing in 2007 in Iowa. And for a while, the sort of rule was we have to pretend this isn't happening, and that because it's obviously not true and malicious, and so we're just going to not write about it or talk about it.
And not visit the Indonesian madrasa.
And the campaign isn't going to write about it or is going to refuse to engage in any way, and that will make it go away. And just as a matter of fact, obviously did not make it go away. I wrote a story about it very early, got yelled at a bit, about like this is a piece of nonsense that is being circulated. The campaign then totally pivoted and decided the best way to deal with it was to address it very, very frontally. I mean, you'd rather live in a society where public officials didn't get up and say insane stuff, but I don't think you can just sort of pretend that that's not happening.
I think the fact checks they're much better than they used to be. I mean, we were all very delicate about them, as Ben said, in the early going, trying not to perpetuate a mistruth, but then nobody knew what the hell you were talking about. So I think the written ones are pretty good. I think the problem is folks like us and people on television who are just talking and talking and talking and may not necessarily remember to say which is untrue. Which is untrue.
But also, like, politics isn't mostly a factual matter. People aren't saying that and repeating it because they think Trump did the research. Like, and sometimes, like, we all trick ourselves into thinking, like, if only we could sit down with these voters and explain to them. That's not what's happening.
Let's take one more question. Somebody had one. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Maya Cox. I'm a graduate student in the Reporting in the Nation program. So I have a statement and a question. First would be, you have investigative reporters like, I believe his name was Gary Webb, who exposed the CIA for, bringing crack into the central LA during the 80s for funding the war in Nicaragua or something like that. So my question would be, Gary Webb, his career was kind of like tarnished for his statements and his conspiracy theories as an investigative journalist. So you guys as editors for a news organization, is it you guys' responsibility to kind of support journalists uncovering like serious topics like that?
I mean, that's like a great story, and I feel like I may not be as deep in the weeds of it as you possibly are. Maybe you're not either. I mean, this was a story that was like widely ridiculed at the time, also wrong in lots of ways. He got lots of stuff wrong, and some parts of what you said are true and parts are not true about the CIA's involvement in Nicaragua and being close to cocaine smugglers, yes, orchestrating deliberately a huge conspiracy to addict African Americans in LA to cocaine, no. And that was sort of the Gary Webb thesis, but also great investigative journalists are kind of always insane and always come to you with something that is if you see Cy Hirsch, the great investigative journalist of our generation, alive, there's stuff that gets published in the New Yorker, like the Abu Ghraib revelations, that was one of the most important stories ever. And then there'll be stuff that gets published in the London Review of Books because the New Yorker wouldn't publish it. And you're sort of I don't know. And so there is this, I'm not really answering your question, but one of the things as an editor is that you have these unbelievably brilliant conspiracy-minded journalists who find things nobody else can find, but then also go and find a lot of stuff that is not there. And you have to sort of protect them by publishing the true stuff and protecting them from publishing the stuff that is not true. And I think, without knowing the Gary Webb story that well, my impression is that he had found some real things and then went way beyond them. And it's to some degree the responsibility of editors to get people like that to get the real stuff. But that's a really complicated, interesting management challenge, I would say.
I would say the answer to your question about what do editors owe investigative reporters, it's really great editors, really great investigative editors who do what we used to call prosecutorial editing. You try and take the story apart so that you chip away all the stuff that shouldn't be there until you have what should be there. But
Which is like a nightmare, and everybody hates each other the entire time.
It's true. It's absolutely true. But that's the only way you're going to get the good stuff. You have to be as headstrong and cantankerous as the reporters. You owe them that.
I do think it's an interest. The Webb case was in the early 90s, as I recall, or late 80s? Late 80s. Early. I do think it's an interesting, it's the really important, I'm really glad you asked this question. I don't know the case super well, but my basic recollection comports with what Ben said, that, he found a lot. He probably bit off a little bit more than he was capable of proving. And yeah, I think partly this was, I think it would be different today, because I think today it might stir up a giant, social media maelstrom about what's going on here. And then maybe that would have pressured better resourced or news organizations to dig into what were the kernels of truth there. Because certainly it's not in dispute that the national security agencies were helping these Central American countries. Again, I think proving the causal, that whether there was an intentional plan to addict, millions of minority Americans, I don't think he ever quite nailed that. But that doesn't mean he didn't nail many important things.
Yeah,
but that's not what people picked up. They didn't pick up the threads that were true. They attacked the paper.
right, which led to the tragic end of his career and all that. Yeah.
One more? Go ahead. I think that's the last question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Taylor. I'm an undergrad in the Media and Communications program at Steinhardt. And you've all spoken at length about like the importance of transparency and accuracy when reporting on sensitive materials. And so I'm wondering kind of how you would recommend we can best like communicate those decisions that we're making, whether or not we choose to publish something and why that is. Like, is that something that should be baked into our reporting, or is that something that should be kind of communicated in like an outside medium?
You know, it's a good question. There's a period when I would have said, just like respond, like nice people on Twitter will ask you friendly, thoughtful questions about the nature of your journalism, and you should fully engage them. And there was this like great period from like 2011 to 2013 when you could have these very open public conversations with people who weren't just trying to destroy you. I wouldn't do that now. I don't know.
There's a lot of stuff that you aren't publishing that you don't need to tell people about, right? Because, as Steve said earlier, there's a lot of dreck that comes in that doesn't meet your standards, and you're not going to publish it, and you're not going to then do a story that says, we found out this thing that probably isn't true, and we're not publishing it because it's probably not true. But I think, yes, I appreciate that more reporters now are explaining in the story how they know something, and the people they're talking to, how they know something. And I think we should do more of that, explaining what we are reporting on and how we got it and why we think it's true.
So the New Yorker recently published a Shouts and Murmurs, you know, the humor column, and it was written by Bruce Headlam and another person, and it was basically, the title headline is How We Got the Story. And each it's ridiculous, of course. It's like we made 800 LinkedIn requests and, you know, called 311. I mean, it was a joke, but of course I think ultimately, you know, that would be taken way too far. But I do think that the impulse of how we got the story, what we did to produce the story, how many people we talked with, I think that's actually a really, really good thing. On the social media front, I totally agree with Ben. I respond to readers, and it's deeply important to me. I find that if someone's serious enough to offer real criticism, they will find my email, which is on the website, and email me, and I'll be happy to engage with them. I'm less likely to do that now on any social platform.
Yeah, but being non-defensive in the way you think about it is really important.
I'd just add that I think data journalists are sometimes a little ahead on this. Yeah. So the notion of saying the markup does this, here's how we got the story, and I think journalists in general can do that. If you're doing it in print, you can do a box or a sidebar that says, you know, here's how we got the story, here's how many sources we have. But I also think it's incredibly important to say what you don't know as well as what you do know, because it's a classic journalistic attempt to sort of write around the holes in your story and pretend that there isn't a hole there. And I think if you can say, whether it's video, audio, or print, if you can say high up, we just don't know this yet, but this is what we do know. I think that also builds trust, helps people understand that we have some humility, we understand the stuff we don't know, but we want to share with you the stuff that we do know. I think we should end it here. I really want to thank the panelists, great panel, really appreciate. You know, these are people who have tremendous experience, very busy. Delighted that you spent the time with us. Thank the audience for the great questions and the great thoughts. Our next event is September 24th at lunchtime. It's Dr. John LaPook talking about ethics issues in medical reporting. He's bringing clips, and he's going to talk to those clips. So we're going to put up registration for that. Thanks very much for being here. Take care.
Thank you, Steve.